Well, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at selective focus. We're going to use this portrait snapshot I did to demonstrate this tutorial. And we're going to be looking at the portrait shot on different focal lengths and show you the good and bad points of that. We're also going to show you the same image shot at different apertures and show why a wide aperture really isolates your subject and focuses attention on your subject. We're also then going to take one of the images with a deep depth of field, a sharp background, into Photoshop, and we're going to try and recreate this effect digitally. So that's what's ahead. So let's get cracking. So we're going to start this tutorial by showing you the same subject shot with different focal lengths and different apertures, just so that you're clear on what I'm going on about, hopefully. So this was a shot here that's shot at 70mm at f11, and as you can see, it's not bad. It's only a snapshot, but it's not a bad snapshot, and the background's quite busy. There's quite a lot of colour in there and quite a lot going on, some dappled light at the top here, but it's not too bad, but it can be a lot better. Now if I shot the same image at 70mm but at f2.8, which is the widest aperture on my L series Canon lens, you can see straight away the background's a lot more less distracting than previously. So there's the f11 and there's f2.8, so it really isolates your subject against the background and focuses all the attention on the face here. So that's what we're talking about today. We're also going to take this image, the one that's shot at f11, and we're going to try and recreate this one, but do it digitally. So let's say you've been out and shot a lovely image of your daughter, your son, or your brother, or your mum, or whoever, and it's quite a distracting background. We're going to show you how to take this into Photoshop and try and recreate something similar to this, just to isolate the portrait. While we're here, we're just also going to look at quickly at why we use longer lenses for this type of shot rather than wide angles. Well, here's the same image shot with a wide angle lens. Now, I haven't gone in too close on this one. I've restrained myself and kept myself back a bit. Even so, you can already see there's quite a lot of distortion here. His nose is in a shape. His chin is quite protruding here, and it's just generally not a very flattering picture. If you're looking to do something a bit at the ordinary, then that's fine, but if you're looking to do a flattering picture of somebody, you really want to avoid using wide angle lenses, because it will definitely distort the features of your subject. And as I said, this is quite restrained. I've kept myself back away from him on this picture, but even so, we've still got some distortion. The other thing is, this is shot at f2.8, the same as this one, and you can see straight away the background is a lot sharper than on this longer lens. Now that is a characteristic of these lenses. In generally, the wider the lens, the harder it is to drop the focus in a background. You've got that quite a bit more sharpness from front to back, where longer lenses isolate your subject much better. So at the same aperture, you're going to get a much shallower depth of field. So I hope you understand that. So in general, avoid wide angles, mainly for the distortion reason. On the other end of the spectrum, here's one I did with 126mm lens. Now if you compare that, this is wide open. If you compare this to the wide open shot on the 70mm, again, we've gone up a notch again. These are much more blurred. So again, that longer focal length is softened the background and isolate the subject even further. So don't worry, we'll go over these key points again a bit later, but I just wanted to show you visually differences. So one last time, this is 126mm at f4, which is wide open on that lens, and this is the same shot wide open on a 70mm. So you can see there's quite a bit of difference. Also, if you look at his face, it's just generally more flattering. It compresses. Longer lenses tend to compress the perceived distances between elements, so you get like a compressing effect. So it's much more flattering, I think, on that length of lens. But there's certainly nothing wrong with the 70mm either, but generally you want to be looking at 70mm plus for doing these type of headshots. Now, when we're working at these wide apertures and creating these beautifully isolated portraits, we have to be very careful on our focusing, especially with longer lenses. You don't have a lot of leeway, so always focus on the eyes with the portrait. That's the most important aspect of those. 99.9% of the time, anyway, unless you're doing something a little bit different. So always focus on the eyes, and obviously focusing is quite critical because you are working at such wide apertures. If you've got a group of people in shot, that's going to be even more tricky because you're going to need to line those up on the same plane. Otherwise, if one's slightly behind the other one, you're not going to get them all in focus. So that's a little bit more tricky. So you probably have to stop your lens down a little bit sharper for those type of shots. Maybe even down to f/16 if it's a group shot and they're all stacked up behind each other in a group, like maybe at a wedding or a school photograph. You've got no choice. You've got to shoot at a small aperture. But again, we can use these Photoshop techniques I'm about to show you to help drop any distracting objects in the background out of focus. So bear that in mind. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to pretend that we didn't know none of this, and we've got a lovely shot, but it's got a distracting background. So what can we do? Well, quite easily, we can take this into Photoshop and try and create something a bit more like this. It won't be exactly the same, but we can get another version of it. The most important thing is to isolate our subject. So that's what we're going to do now. So now we're in Photoshop. This is our image on the left here we're going to be working on, and this is the kind of effect we were looking to recreate. So I'm going to drop that one out the way. As in all good Photoshop tutorials, it's quite often we need to make masks, and this is no different. Obviously, this is not a masking tutorial, so I'm going to presume you know a little bit about that. If not, I'm sure there's lots of good videos available there which will go over the various masking techniques. So first thing I'm going to do is isolate our model, Gabriel here, from the background. Right, so our mask is completed, and there it is. Now, what we could do, as I mentioned earlier, we could just use the Gaussian blur filter, which would be a lot simpler, to be honest with you. Just load that as a selection. Go to Layers, duplicate the background there. With the selection still active, add a layer mask, and then go to our background. Let's just duplicate that. Go to the blur layer here. Go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and what that would do is enable us to blur the background as much as we want, like so. We could then go in if we wanted to and refine this mask and just bring out some bits of details or knock some more details back where we want it. So that's before, that's after. So it does the job, but it just looks a bit fake. And this is where this other filter comes into place. This is filter, blur, lens blur, which we'll look at in a second, which enables us to be a bit more specific with the settings and really emulate the characteristics of a lens and how that applies to blurring, like we did in camera earlier. So let me just turn that off for now. We'll delete that. Let's just call this one Gauss blur for Gaussian blur. We'll leave that one switched off for now. Let's duplicate our background. We'll call this one lens blur, like so. Right, so what we do now, go back to the channels. I want you to look at this mask a second and just think about this. This mask, I'm going to invert it Now, anything white in this mask will allow the filter, the blurring filter, to shine through. So therefore the background in this image, where it's white, will get blurred. The black, which is Gabriel's face, will remain sharp. Okay, so remember that. So white will let the filter come through, black will hold it back. Okay, so what we're going to do now is go to the filter and load up the lens blur filter. Filter, blur, lens blur, and I'll come back in a second because that takes a little bit of a while to load. Okay, so I've got the lens blur dialog box open. The first thing you need to do is make sure your preview is ticked and make sure it's on faster, because the other setting, which is more accurate, takes forever, even with a lot of RAM. Depth maps, depth map. Sorry about that. Depth map is basically your mask you made. So we're going to load that mask there, okay, and you'll see that now the preview refreshing. That is doing its job. It's allowing the background to blur, but keeping Gabriel's face nice and sharp. The next one is blur focal distance. Now we'll come back to that in a minute. So we'll skip on to iris. This is basically the shape of the iris, and I leave mine on octagon. You can change it if you wish to and have a play around. Radius is the amount of blurring. We're going to put that right up to 100%. Blade curvature is basically how round the iris is, the blades of the iris. Again, you can play around with that one. That has subtle differences. And the same as rotation, that's basically the angle of the iris. So again, have a play around with that. Specular highlights, that helps us bring back some brightness values. When we blur the background, the highlights tend to dull down. So what we can do with this is basically just bring them back up again, just brighten those specular highlights here, and you can see here they've gone a bit too far, so I'd look at bringing that value back up a bit. So the threshold basically allows the various intensities of highlights, specular highlights, to come through, and the brightness is basically the brightness values of those, so you can turn those up and down. You can see that in the background now. I think for this one I'll be looking around 245. That's a bit better, and I'd find that a little bit distracting, so I'd be looking at bringing the brightness of that down as much as possible. Perhaps even bring this up to 250. That's a bit better. So that's just basically gives you control over the highlight areas. So that's the basic settings for that. And again, like I said, go in and have a play around. And the final thing to look at is the blur focal distance. For this particular image at this second, we don't need to worry about that. Let me just turn off the preview so we can see it before. We'll just wait for the computer to decide to catch up. It's running a bit slow at the moment. So that's before, and that is after. So you can see we've already made quite a big difference there. And the thing is, now we can click OK on this, and that'll open up in Photoshop in a while. I think it's taking a bit of a while. It does take a bit of power this to run this filter, and that'll open up in Photoshop, and we can go back in and edit it a bit further because it's on a separate layer. Right, so there's our lens blur layer loaded. That's before, there's after, so that's got a big difference. And what we could do at this stage is go to channels, grab our mask, load that as a selection, go back to layers and just add a layer mask to our lens blur layer like so. And what that enables us to do is to go in, and any parts here that are badly masked, we could just go in and paint with a small paintbrush with black, and just paint back in some details like so, just very lightly. I'm using a pressure sensitive pen and tablet, so I can adjust the opacity by just how much pressure I'm applying, or you can do, if you're using a mouse, is go to the opacity slider up here and adjust it there. So that just makes it a bit more versatile, like so. And the same here, if you want to take the effect away in some areas, we can just gently paint back in any bits of detail we want. As I said, I didn't mask this very well, it's just done very quickly just to demonstrate this tutorial. So that just gives you a bit of versatility. But there is a further step we can take with this, which is a little bit more complicated, but again, it just gives us a much more realistic effect. So I'll show you a brief overview of that next. To take this a step further and to even make it even more realistic, we could actually selectively blur certain areas that bit further. So maybe looking at this picture now, I think that if we bring up the other one, the one that was shot through camera, if we look at this, you'll notice that his shoulders, are slightly dropped out of focus. The hat here has dropped out of focus, and the back of the hat has dropped out of focus. So we could actually, using this lens filter dialog box, we can actually add that to the mask. So if we went to channels and got the mask there, we could actually duplicate this, and I'll call this one transition mask. And we could literally go around certain areas with a paintbrush and just selectively paint in the areas with grey, or even blur them. So for instance, let's get the lasso tool. Let's say we want to look at the top of this hat here. So we might decide to draw a selection around the top of the hat here. Very gently like that. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. That's a bit too much, but maybe about 5 pixels might be enough. Try that. Deselect that. We then have a look here. We might then want to do a little bit around the hair, both sides, and definitely the hat. So let's just the hair here actually is a bit further forward, so it'd probably be less blurred, and the hat bit at the back would probably be more blurred. So bear that in mind. So let's go here. Let's go draw a selection around this area. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and I think maybe it might be a little bit more, no, probably a little bit less than the top of the hat. So let's go for a 3.5 pixel blur there, and the back of the hat, let's just leave that on a second while I do my selection. The back of the hat here, maybe down there would be a little bit. Actually, we don't do that. We'll just do the back of the hat, like so. Now that I think would be more blurred than the rest. So blur, Gaussian blur, and let's give that, I reckon, probably about 7. So around there. Then again here, filter, blur, let's try somewhere about 3 again, I think around there somewhere. Command D to deselect that. So that's one way of doing it. As I said, we could also do it with a paintbrush, and what I'm trying to do here is just create areas of grey which are going to be like transitions, and it's going to allow the blurring to react slightly different. Rather than being sort of black and white, there's going to be that grey area, which is going to enable us the effect to be more subtle and have a nicer transition to it, and it should just create that little extra blurring. So we could, let's say, do it with a paintbrush tool, set to grey, and just paint in areas like this. But it's not as I don't think the effect is quite the same. But I prefer to do it the way I've done it, which was to blur it. So let's give it a try. So let's duplicate our background. I'll switch off the lens blur. We call this one lens blur so transitions. Go to filter, blur, lens blur, like so. We'll allow that to load up. Our image is now loaded into lens blur once again. I've set the source to the transition mask up here, and we're going to have a little play around with this blur focal distance. Now this slightly goes from 0, which represents black, to 255, which represents white. Now I've already explained that black in our mask means that there's no adjustment being made, and white meaning there's full adjustment being made. So depending obviously on which way your mask is set up, because obviously you can invert the mask. So basically we just need to adjust this slider, and this slider will allow depending on the tones in the mask, allow how much of the blurring is going to come through. So at the moment we're set on 13%. I'll just turn the preview off so we can have a quick look at that. There we go. It's taking a bit of time to catch up yet again, and then there's with it switched on. So at the moment that's looking pretty good. I think we can come a little bit further up, so let's just drag the slider up a touch, and again we need to wait for it to catch up. That's on to 24 now, and let's have a quick look at that. Now that's gone a bit too far because we're actually now encroaching onto Gabriel's face. So I think somewhere, I'm going to type this in, somewhere around 16 might work for us. Okay. Right. So that's at 16 now. There's before. There's after. And we can see it's actually coming into these areas now. So that's looking pretty good. There's still, it's still not perfect. There's still a little bit of work to do on the hair and stuff around here, but it's a pretty good set of settings, I think. So we can just click OK on that, and we'll let that process out. So here we are back into Photoshop, excuse me, and here's our lens blur with the transitions. I'm just going to drag it above our other lens blur layers just so I can show you the difference. So here's our first lens blur, like so, and then here's the lens blur with the transitions set. So that's a much more natural. It's got a bit more drop off around the top of the hat there, and also the back here on the hat. So a much more natural image. And like I said, we can then add another layer mask onto this and just tidy up some of these hairs should we wish to. So just drag that back down there. So there we have it. There's the before image, and there's the after. So it's just, let me just zoom out a little bit so you can see a little bit better what's going on. So I think you'll agree that it just focuses the attention onto our model here. As I said, we still need a bit of cleaning up to do, but overall it's made a very good job of that. So not too long a job, but we could have avoided it by just selecting the correct aperture in the first place. So just bear that in mind. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll hope to catch you on the next one. Cheers.